Good morning. We're going to go over um, some pollination and how uh, different plants go through that pollination process. Again, I'm not sure how much of this you already know. My guess is you have probably heard some of this, but maybe not all of it. So we'll go ahead and get started. Actinomorphic versus zygomorphic. Um, this is referring to the symmetry of your flower. Actinomorphic means that it exhibits radial symmetry that's considered to be a regular type of symmetry. So I don't want to call it the normal, but kind of the normal. And then you got your zygomorphic plants or flowers, which are going to exhibit bilateral symmetry or symmetry on one plane only, and that's considered to be irregular. So that one's not as common. So if you look at your diagrams, um, they should show you these three different versions that the flowers can take. Hypogynous is occurs when you have your ovary is above everything else, or everything else is fused below it, or the actual ovary. So the ovary is the most superior structure. So the pictures there are just kind of showing you that everything is technically below, at least attached below the ovary itself. So now, for example, the stamens technically rise higher than your ovary, but they don't start higher than the ovary. So perigynous, these are this occurs in flowers where the ovary it's technically below the other parts, so it's technically inferior, but it's got a structure called the floral cup that it uses. So yeah, the ovary though is not fused to this floral cup or floral tube. So, but other things are. When you're talking about an epigynous floral structure, you're talking about where the ovary is inferior to the rest of the other whorls, so the petals, sepals, etc. There's two different pictures there. The left one is an apple flower, and so the stamens are attached to the top part of the ovary there, and then in the fuchsia flower on the right side, it's actually attached to the floral tube, the stamen are. So sometimes they can be attached directly to the ovary, sometimes they can be attached to the floral tube there. So, but that kind of gives you an idea of the three different structures that flowers will take. When we're talking about, there's technically another one. It's called the composite flower. And if you flip your piece of paper over, we've got you've got several ovaries here in this particular type of thing, because it's not gonna have just one ovary. It's gonna have a lot. I think I've written up there. It's the members of the sunflower family are considered to be composite flowers. They're the most well-known composite flowers, and I'm sure you've seen sunflowers, so you know that you've got the sepals down there. I guess they don't have it labeled, but you've got the base, which is the head. And if you recall from yesterday with the different flower structures, I told you one was the head, and that was the one that looks kind of like this, but it had, and I just drew the circles there, and each one of those was technically a different flower. This is kind of the same thing here, except instead of smaller flowers um, along there, it's going to be ovaries or individual carpels. And then some of those carpels are going to are actually going to have petals coming off of them. So primarily, though, it's just going to be on the sunflower family. It's just going to be around the edges. But if you've ever actually looked really closely at a sunflower, you can kind of see all of these different parts. So basically, your sunflower head here is made up of two different types of florets. The first being a disc, and the second being a ray. So they are both epigynous. So that means that the ovary is technically inferior to all the other parts. So the disc floret there. So basically, we're talking smaller flowers, smaller versions of flowers. So your disc floret is actinomorphic, which means it's got radial symmetry there. Usually those are going to be found in the middle of your flower. So, like I said, if you've ever looked at a sunflower, you actually look really closely, you can kind of see these little miniature disc florets there in the center. And then going around the peripheral part of the sunflower itself are going to be these ray florets, and those are going to have petals. The disc florets don't. So, but you can kind of see they both have the stigma branches, they've got anthers, and things like that. But the difference is the ray florets are going to have the petals also, and so those are only located on that periphery, which makes sense. Like I said, if you've seen a sunflower before, which I assume you have, you can kind of picture that. So picture what I'm talking about there. So so these are the major three in terms of their ovary structure, and then this is one more arrangement of your flower that uses the florets. So just kind of some interesting knowledge there for you. Okay, now we're going to get into the pollination. Okay, with pollination, obviously it's the act of transferring pollen grains from one area to a receptive stigma. So from an anther to a stigma. Now, this can happen in two different ways. It can be through self-pollination, and it can also be through cross-pollination. So these are the two mechanisms that plants can use. With your self-pollination, self-explanatory, this is the stuff that I assume you've already heard about. It's going to, self-pollinators are going to make their own pollen, and that pollen is going to fertilize its own seeds. Okay, most plants don't do this. It causes inbreeding. Generally, you're going to see self-pollinators in extreme weather conditions, either in extremely dry, hot areas like desert-type places, or extremely cold, like up in Alaska, up in the Arctic areas. Some plants might be able to pollinate through self-pollination simply because it might be the distance between them and another plant might be so vast that they need to be able to self-pollinate in order to survive and in order to pass their genes on. So anyway, the second way that plants can go through pollination is through cross-pollination, where you've got the pollen from one plant fertilizing the seeds from a different plant. So this is the method that most plants take, is through cross-pollination, and ensures genetic variation, outbreeding, stuff like that. Oftentimes, these plants will use pollinators to help spread the pollen. So it might be wind, or a member of the animal kingdom of sorts, so an insect, some sort of animal, you know. Um, Most times in cross-pollination, these particular plants will have chemical means or pollen size differences to prevent, mechanisms in place to prevent self-pollination. So they might produce one size pollen, but they will only accept smaller pollen or something like that. They've got chemical receptors on there that prevent the pollen from fertilizing its own seed. So those plants do have some mechanisms with which to prevent the self-pollination. So I've given you a chart here, kind of just looking at general characteristics of the different types of pollinators, whether it's wind or insects. Those seem to be the two largest methods for pollination, or two major pollinators. So for your wind, if a plant is pollinated by wind, it doesn't necessarily have petals. It may or may not. Generally, they're not going to be very colorful. They're just going to be brown or green, because they don't need to waste energy trying to create these pigments for these petals, because the wind doesn't care what color petals it has, so it's not going to waste that energy doing that. So, however, with insects, they need, oftentimes they need to have those bright colors on their petals, so that way they can get a pollinator to come over and pollinate. So with the wind, generally there's no nectar, there's no odor. You don't need the nectar there. You don't need the reward for the pollinator, because the wind isn't going to need nectar, nor will it need the odor. It doesn't need, again, the wind isn't attracted by odor or nectar, so why waste valuable energy making nectar or odor? However, with insects, they're going to have nectar because they need to have some sort of reward for their pollinators to come over. Otherwise, why would the insects even bother? There needs to be some sort of reward for them. And oftentimes there is an odor, which is why oftentimes flowers have a smell, because the insects, for the most part, don't see very well. So again, this is another mechanism to attract your pollinators to come over and actually do the pollination. With your stamens, for a wind-pollinated plant, they're usually longer and dangly, so that way when the wind blows, it's able to take the pollen with it. With insects, it's going to be specifically positioned so that the insect will have to brush up against it, so that way it will actually take and transport the pollen. Stigma, for the wind, it's usually sticky and kind of feathery, and it sticks out, so that way, again, you have the best possible chance of the pollen that's moving through the wind to attach to your stigma to go down the style and into the ovary to fertilize the ovules. With insects, it's going to be specifically positioned. So again, as the insect comes to take some nectar, not only will it maybe pick up some pollen, but it will also deposit pollen from another plant. The efficiency in terms of wind pollination, it's not very efficient. I mean, that makes sense. You're relying on wind, and timing has to be just right, and the wind strength has to be just right and going in just the right direction. So it's obviously not very efficient. However, with insects, it's a little bit more efficient, so they don't have to make quite as many pollen grains because it is more direct. So I believe I have a um, a table here. If you flip a little bit more on your stuff, and it just kind of goes over some pollinators here. So we're going to go into these in just a second. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. For your pollinators, there's three, we call these pollination syndromes that you have to meet. And so for the pollinators, a couple of the specific pollination syndromes that you must meet would be the pollinator has to be attracted to the flower, which is oftentimes why there's odor or color or something like that on the petals of the flower itself. Another syndrome is that the pollinator must receive a reward, and generally that's in the form of nectar. Otherwise, they're not going to waste their time. Why would they come over and visit? And then the flower must facilitate pollination. So the pollen needs to be placed appropriately. The stigma needs to be placed appropriately to ensure proper pollination. So those are the three major pollination syndromes. So these are some specific some more specific syndromes for you, and methods or ways that that your pollinators kind of goes into the pollinators and what traits they have. So for bees, they get nectar from the nectary, the place that, or the gland that produces the nectar. They need, if you are going to be pollinated by a bee, you have to have a landing site for them. They don't take the nectar and fly like hummingbirds do. They can see in ultraviolet light, so yellow and blue flowers tend to be the best for those particular wavelengths, and so that kind of ensures that the bees can spot them easily. For beetles, if you're pollinated by a beetle, they have a very strong odor since they're a little more susceptible to scents and odors. They don't see very well, so the flowers don't oftentimes make crazy pigment colors because the beetles don't see very well in those colors. So, and then oftentimes the beetles will eat some of those pollen grains as well. So, if you're pollinated by flies, they're also attracted by different odors, and so it's not uncommon for them to have those flowers that are pollinated by flies to give off unpleasant odors. Usually through trichomes, they are going to have large, flat petals that are maybe brown or red, darker in color. Sorry, apparently we're going to ask for help there. Sorry, Leah just hit the computer. So, if you are pollinated by butterflies, they can detect red colors, so it's not uncommon for those to be shades of red, although they can come in different colors. And then because of the butterflies' long mouths, they've got a long corolla tube, and then the nectar is down there at the bottom of that tube, since that's anatomically how the butterflies are built. So for moths, they're attracted to sweet fragrances, so oftentimes those flowers are going to have a sweet fragrance, and since moths come out at night, it's not uncommon for these flowers to give off a little bit of a burst of the fragrance around dusk, since that's when the moths are waking up. They don't see super well, but they see, so they need to have lighter colored flowers that can be seen easily in the dark. So you're going to have whites and light pinks and, pale colors like that. Birds If you're going to be pollinated by birds, they generally don't have an odor because birds don't really pick up on the odors, and so they've got really good eyesight. So generally, those flowers are going to be red or yellow, nice and bright. These flowers are generally epigynous, so the ovaries are the most inferior part. These guys are going to have nectar also, and so um, because of that, they're going to give a lot of sugar water off. Birds need a little bit more energy than your bees or your flies or something, so high sugar content. Bats, again, like with the moths, those particular flowers are going to need to be lighter in color because bats are going to be primarily active at night, so they need to be light or a very pale light color. Um, they don't see particularly well, so they also give off a fairly strong aroma. And then, just like with the birds, they require a little more energy, so the nectar, and they're bigger animals than, say, a bee, so they need to make a lot of nectar for those bats. So, and um, bats, for the most part, are around the tropic area and the warmer areas, so that's where these particular flowers are going to be. Um, Orchid flowers are a little different. They require different pollinators, not just one, and so they're a little bit different. And they group their pollen grains into little sacs, polonium, and then they they have a sticky substance on the outside of them, and in hopes that they will attach to the pollinator, and then the pollinator will carry those pollen sacs to another orchid flower. So the last thing that I've got on your handouts would be that table there that kind of goes a little bit more in depth on the pollinators and the floral adaptations. So it's some of it's stuff that I've just gone over, but they'll give you what the pollinator is and specifically what plants these particular pollinators pollinate. They'll tell you a little bit more on the color, the shape, if they have a scent, and other just random information there for you. So I won't go over that. You can kind of read all that. So, but anyway, um, like I said, we're going to shoot to have a test probably late next week, probably next Friday. So tomorrow you'll have a quiz. Again, as always, if you have any questions whatsoever, just let me know. Otherwise, have a good day.